Tonight we're going to tie up some loose ends, and then I promise you that next week we'll actually get back to Revelation 20. We'll hit 21, 22, and wrap up the book. But the last 2 weeks I've been talking about church Israel replacement stuff. 2 weeks ago, or was that 3 weeks ago, because there was a missing week in there, we read the promises from Isaiah and Jeremiah of the continuation of Israel as a nation before God. And last week we looked at some of the key verses that are used by Israel church replacement theologians. However, even though we hit the key verses, there are a couple of other verses that are sort of the implication verses that are oftentimes tied into the church Israel replacement theology overall. And if I don't take the time, trust me when I tell you, if I don't take the time to address them this evening, I will be accused of purposefully ignoring them. And so we're going to look at 3 passages tonight that are used by church Israel replacement theologians to create the idea, the notion of a spiritual Israel, or a new Israel, or a genuine Israel, any of that language where you get to put a qualifier or an adjective on the front of Israel. So we're going to look at the verses tonight that are used to kind of plant that idea. If you buy into the idea of a spiritual Israel, then it's just a jump ball. From there you can go to all these spiritual implications and say, well then, things like the land promise that was promised to Israel specifically can be fulfilled in a spiritual sense in spiritual Israel, because now we've established that there is a spiritual Israel. So we're going to look at the 3 primary passages tonight. First, we're going to read the verses that are typically used. Believe me when I tell you, I think by now you believe me anyway, but if you go online and you just look at basic church Israel replacement theology, they're all going to use these 3 passages. These passages will be cited. Not only will they be cited, but they will claim things about these verses that simply don't appear in the verses. And this is, again, my chief complaint with so much of amillennial or church replacement theology, is that they see too much in a verse. They see more in a passage than is actually there. Like we saw last week, not all Israel is of Israel, and they'll say, well there, if not all Israel is of Israel, and then they'll misquote it as not all Israel is Israel, okay, now we can redefine Israel, and so everyone who is in Christ and believes is now Israel. We have now created a new Israel or a spiritual Israel. And of course, when we looked at the text last week, we found that nowhere did Paul actually create the paradigm of a new Israel or a spiritual Israel. All he was saying was that not everyone who was a descendant of Israel was counted for the seed, and throughout Romans 9, he then narrowed the path of the seed to Christ. But he didn't throw open the door and say, now everybody who believes is technically Israel. Tonight we're going to look at passages like the one in Romans, where Paul is going to argue about whether a person is a Jew simply because they're circumcised, or if they are a Jew, as Paul's going to say, who believe in Christ, because Judaism would naturally then lead to Christ. It's passages like that that the church Israel folks get a hold of and say, there, see right there, Paul says right there, it's not those that are circumcised that are a Jew, it's those that believe then that are a Jew. I remember a couple of years ago, Mike and I going out to Franklin to hear a preacher out there who had come down from Kentucky, and he was teaching church replacement, and Mike was just becoming familiar with the church Israel arguments and understanding them more clearly, and this fellow said, everyone who believes in Jesus is now spiritually a Jew. I'm a Jew. And I remember Mike turning and just locking eyes with me and raising his eyebrows, and for the first time it struck him how pervasive this kind of thinking was and how much damage it does to biblical theology, because there's simply nowhere in the Bible where Paul says that those who believe in Christ are now somehow spiritually Jewish. So basically 3 passages, 2 out of Romans, 1 out of Galatians. Let's start with the Romans passages. We're going to start with Romans 4, and then we'll go back to Romans 2 to put the whole thing together, because this is typically the order that the church Israel folks will argue. In Romans 4, they will cite Romans 4, verses 11 and 12. This is a citation that appears in practically all church Israel replacement theology. Romans 4:11 and 12 say, "And he," we're speaking of Abraham here, "he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had, yet being uncircumcised." Now that's a whole lot of language that's easy to mess with. The conclusion, once they cite that, the conclusion they come to is, it says right here that Abraham is the father of all the faithful, whether they are circumcised or not circumcised, and they will tie that to Galatians 3:29. Turn over there. Keep your finger in Romans. Turn over to Galatians 3:29. Everybody there? Nope. I hear pages flipping. It's all right. No, go on. I'll wait. I have nowhere to be. I lead a very lonely life.
Galatians what?
3:29.
Thank you.
"And if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise." Now, let's take those two verses from Romans and cram them together with Galatians 3:29 and draw some conclusions. Romans 4:11 and 12 say, "And he received the sign," Abraham received the sign of circumcision, "a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also." So right here, Abraham is called the father of those who believe, even if they're not circumcised. So that means believing Gentiles, Abraham is now the father of. Put that together with Galatians 3:29, "If you be Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." Therefore, Abraham is the father, the spiritual father of all those who believe in Christ. All those who believe in Christ are now spiritual seed of Abraham, and the promises in the book of Genesis given to Abraham were given to Abraham and his seed. And the seed is now defined as everyone who believes in Christ. Therefore, the promises made to Abraham belong to everybody who has faith in Christ, who are the spiritual seed of Abraham. Follow the argument? Therefore, the promise of land belongs not to the Jews or Israel exclusively, but to everyone who believes in Christ. And certainly we can't assume that everyone who believes in Christ is going to go back to Israel or Palestine or that little bit of dirt over there in the Middle East. So therefore the land that is promised cannot mean a physical land over there in the Middle East. Clearly the land then is a spiritualized promise of the ultimate land of glory, where all those who belong to Christ, who are Abraham's spiritual seed, will eventually go to inherit that can only be heaven. So the land that was promised to Abraham is only a type and a foreshadow of the heaven that is promised to all those who have faith in the finished work of Christ. Abraham is their father. They are the seed of Abraham. Therefore, they have the promises that were promised to the seed of Abraham. Did you follow all that? Sounds logical on the face, doesn't it? But the first thing that I did right there, and I did it very deftly, I did it the way that the folks who do the Church Israel replacement stuff do it. I took two verses out of their context, and I crammed them together to create my argument.